Treaty 6, negotiated and signed at Fort Carleton and Fort Pitt, 1876. By the time Treaty 6 was negotiated, conditions on the plains had changed, even since Treaty 1 in 1871. The smallpox epidemic of 1869 to 1870 and the dramatic decline of the bison herds had led to the suffering and starvation of many Plains indigenous people. Concerned with the encroachment on their lands, many felt that signing treaty with the Dominion of Canada on behalf of the Crown was the only viable option to ensure their future. Negotiations at Fort Carleton resulted in a treaty between the Crown and 9 bands of Plains and Woods Cree. A second round of negotiations at Fort Pitt brought 8 more Cree bands into the treaty. In the years to come, other bands would sign out of necessity. Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris had strict orders from Ottawa not to offer better terms than Treaty 4 and Treaty 5 had given: the payment of annuities, the creation of reserves, and some assistance in transitioning to agriculture. However, Morris consented to 2 demands which had not been granted before: the so-called famine clause and the medicine chest clause. These stipulated that, in addition to providing food during the transition to agriculture, the government would provide aid in the case of a general famine, as well as a free chest of medicine to every band. The early stages of implementing Treaty 6 did little to assuage the doubts of those who had not yet signed. It was starvation, rather than persuasion, which prompted major opponents like Lucky Man and Little Pine to sign in 1879, and finally Big Bear in 1882. Some bands who had agreed to the terms and sought to settle on reserves had to wait several years before the lands were surveyed. From 1881 onward, rations were reduced and provided only in exchange for labor, while annuities were to be paid out on reserves or not at all. By 1883, almost all the bands in the Battleford area were settled or beginning to settle on reserves. Chief Poundmaker. Poundmaker, one of the many who became known as Chief of the Plains Cree, brought his people to settle on a reserve along the Cut Knife Creek after entering into Treaty 6 with the Crown of Great Britain and Ireland in 1876. By 1885, Canada's imposition of the Indian Act led to an outbreak of violence in Treaty 6 territory. Feeling caught in the middle of what was then called a rebellion, he made an attempt to let the Indian agent in Battleford know that he and his people would not get involved. However, he and his people would be blamed for the town of Battleford being looted and burned. On May 2, 1885, Canadian military forces were deployed to punish Poundmaker and his people. What was supposed to be a 2-week-long battle only lasted a half day, as Canadian forces would find themselves overwhelmed by the resistance and were forced to retreat. At the request of General Middleton to surrender, Poundmaker and his defenders complied and were arrested at Fort Battleford, here, on May 26, 1885. He was later convicted of treason felony and sentenced to 3 years at Stony Mountain Penitentiary in Manitoba. On May 23, 2019, the Canadian government officially exonerated Poundmaker and admitted they were wrong to convict him and to treat him as a criminal, and that all Canadians must now learn the truth, that he was a true peacemaker. Moosomin was the headman of a band that wintered north of the North Saskatchewan River, near Jackfish and Turtle Lakes. In 1879, when his chief, Yellow Sky, refused to sign Treaty 6, Moosomin and 124 followers asked to be admitted to the treaty and to have their own reserve. A tract 12 miles northwest of Battleford was surveyed for them in 1881. Yellow Sky was recognized as chief of Moosomin's band until 1884. Initially, Moosomin followed the lead of Poundmaker and refused to sow crops as a protest over treaty promises that had not been kept. However, his band quickly transitioned into becoming capable farmers who were noted as being the most peaceable and reliable Indians in the district by Indian Commissioner Edgar Dewdney. Conflict over the land set aside for Moosomin began in the late 1880s, even before the reserve was confirmed by the order in council in 1889. By 1888, settlers from the Battleford area had delivered a petition to the local member of parliament complaining about the success of the Indian bands in farming and calling for the Moosomin and Thunderchild reserves to be moved across the river. While departmental officials initially protected the reserves, when Moosomin died around 1902, the Indian agent refused to recognize his son, Josie Moosomin, as the band's chief. It wasn't until June 21, 1909, that the Canadian government recognized his title, just days after the surrender was finally secured. Minahi Kosis. Little Pine was born around 1830 in the Fort Pitt region of present-day Saskatchewan. He rose to prominence as a warrior during conflicts with the Blackfoot, including the Battle of Belly River near Lethbridge. By the end of the 1860s, Little Pine was the chief of his own band, which numbered around 300 people. Determined to protect his people's way of life, Little Pine refused to take treaty with the Canadian government in 1876, along with other Cree leaders. Although Little Pine resisted and held out for 3 years before signing Treaty 6, in 1879 he was persuaded in order to attain relief for his starving people. In 1883, Little Pine and his band moved to the Battleford area and camped next to the reserve of Poundmaker. The two chiefs organized a council of Cree chiefs of the Battleford and Fort Pitt area in June 1884 to discuss the idea of one large reserve for all Plains Cree. With subsequent conflicts forced the council to disband, Little Pine, along with Chief Big Bear and others, persisted in their efforts to create a unified Plains Cree territory. In 1885, Little Pine died on the Poundmaker Reserve without seeing his dream of a unified territory come to pass. Mistahimakswa, Chief Big Bear. Born in 1825, Big Bear assumed power while still a young man and eventually became chief of the Crees of the Western Plains. He received his power bundle, song, and probably his name as a result of a vision of the bear spirit, the most powerful spirit venerated by the Crees. When Treaty 6 was negotiated in 1876, Big Bear was not summoned by Canada and arrived after negotiations concluded. Big Bear refused to take treaty, arguing the terms were insufficient and that forcing his people onto reserves was like putting a rope around their necks. His defiance drew warriors to his camp who desired control of their land, resources, and way of life. In 1882, he was forced to sign the treaty in order to prevent his band from starving. After settling in Frog Lake, Big Bear worked tirelessly but unsuccessfully to receive further concession from the federal government. In 1884, he met with other Cree peoples in Battleford to discuss treaty terms and host a thirst dance. When the Northwest Uprising broke out in 1885, Wandering Spirit, a war chief, took over Frog Lake and most of the white inhabitants were killed. Big Bear counseled for peace and protected the white prisoners. Falsely blamed for the uprising, he was convicted of treason felony and sentenced to 3 years in Stony Mountain Penitentiary. Released early due to illness, Big Bear sought sanctuary among the remnants of his tribe in the Poundmakers and Little Pine reserves. He died January 17, 1888. Sukiman, Chief Mosquito. Mosquito was an Assiniboine chief who reluctantly signed Treaty 6 at Battleford in 1878. A reserve was surveyed for his band in 1879, and they settled on it in the fall of 1880. It was a marginal land just west of the Red Pheasant Reserve. They cleared 30 acres in 2 years, using mostly grub hoes and axes, casting serious doubt on Lieutenant Governor Dewdney's initial impression of them as a wild devil-may-care lot. The band almost tripled in size as a starving groups came in from the open plains, but their farming efforts were undermined by inadequate equipment, bad weather, and government inertia. As their farms failed and government rations were reduced to cut costs, by 1884 they numbered only 125 people. Mosquito distanced himself from the Cree political movement led by Big Bear and promised Indian agent John Ray that he would not become involved in the troubles erupting in 1885. When emissaries from Louis Riel's provisional government arrived to win their allegiance, Mosquito declined their gifts of tobacco. Most of his band retreated into the Miskiwachia, or Eagle Hills, or went south to Montana. But some of his warriors participated in the Battle of Cut Knife Hill. For this, the entire band was labeled as disloyal and had their annuities withheld until 1888. Their missed annuities were finally repaid as part of a 2019 settlement with the federal government. Ipsipimikkakitot, Chief Young Chippewayan. Young Chippewayan was the son of Pointed Hood, who signed Treaty 6. Unhappy with the terms, he joined Poundmaker and the Badger in opposition to the signing. One eyewitness account portrays young Chippewayan as the most vocal of this group. However, he was ignored due to not being a chief. After his father's death, young Chippewayan became chief, and government officials changed the band's name from Chippewayan to Young Chippewayan. Although a reserve at Stony Knoll was surveyed for them in 1879, they did not settle there. In 1885, oral history suggests that most of the band were hunting well to the south when the Northwest resistance flared up. However, they were deemed to have left the reserve, which they had never actually occupied, joined the rebels, and then fled to the United States. Based on this erroneous claim, the government withheld the band's annuities until 1888, at which point the band was no longer recognized. In 1895, the Stony Knoll Reserve was identified as suitable for settlement and opened to Mennonite and German Lutheran settlers. The band was not consulted about the transfer, nor were the new settlers aware of the band's claim on the land. In 1994, the Young Chippewayan Band unsuccessfully filed for compensation, but in 2006 came together with the local Mennonite and Lutheran communities in mutual support, understanding, and reconciliation. Apsiniz, Chief Young Sweetgrass. Young Sweetgrass succeeded his father as chief as a young man. However, he was unsuccessful in holding his band together. In 1882, he and 17 followers joined Strikes Him on the Back, another signatory of Treaty 6. After signing the treaty, Strikes Him on the Back was reluctant to trade his people's mobile lifestyle for a more sedentary existence on a reserve. When pressed on the issue, he insisted on a site in the Eagle Hills, which the government denied on the grounds that there was not enough good agricultural land left there. By 1884, members of the band were leaving, and he was deposed. Young Sweetgrass, still recognized as a hereditary chief, despite not having a band of his own, was then appointed as chief by government officials. A reserve was surveyed west of Battleford, and the band began to sell hay and wood, as well as grow gardens and raise livestock. As the sessional papers for that year record, he is most highly spoken of as an energetic, well-disposed young man. Despite the glowing description, young Sweetgrass always struggled to win the affection and support of band members. As tensions rose in the West, young Sweetgrass withdrew his support for Big Bear's diplomatic initiative. He managed to keep his band out of the violence of 1885 and was later described by one government official as one of the most loyal chiefs in the West. Pihu Ka Mikosit, Chief Red Pheasant. Red Pheasant grew up in the Battle River, Eagle Hills area. He told the Treaty Commissioners in 1876, "Ever since my grandfather lived at Battle River, it has been my home." In his youth, his band was quite mobile, wintering in the woodlands and hunting on the plains in the summer. They began their transition to a more sedentary lifestyle in the early 1870s. Red Pheasant assumed leadership of the band from Wutuni just before the treaty negotiations. He was willing to sign Treaty 6, but his brother Wutuni was not. Red Pheasant initially selected a reserve in what is now the town of Battleford, but when this area was selected for government buildings, he was persuaded to move to the Eagle Hills. His band at this time numbered 105 people. It grew quickly, peaking at 165 in 1877, before dropping slightly to around 140 for most of the 1880s. By 1885, Red Pheasant was gravely ill. As Louis Riel was attempting to gather support to mount a resistance to the unfair policies of the Canadian government, Red Pheasant was unimpressed by Riel's emissaries and declined the tobacco they offered as a gift. He then agreed to go to Battleford to calm the situation there, though not before urging his reserve's farm instructor and schoolteacher to flee with their families. At least some of his band went to Poundmaker's Camp instead. Although 25 men of his band were at Cut Knife Hill and 3 were arrested, Red Pheasant and his 2 brothers, Wutuni and Baptiste, were recognized by the government as loyal Canadians. Piyasu Awasis, Chief Thunderchild. Thunderchild's family belonged to the band of Big Child, one of the Plains Cree chiefs that first signed Treaty 6 in 1876. Initially, Thunderchild rejected the treaty and joined Big Bear and others who hoped to negotiate better terms. Following the collapse of the bison economy, he was forced to accept treaty in 1879. The Department of Indian Affairs recognized Thunderchild as chief of a reserve west of Battleford in 1883. The band had early success with farming and stock raising, but their progress and size, 177 members in 1891, stalled in the 1890s as a result of crop failures, deteriorating health, and departmental policies that limited their market and access to agricultural machinery. Despite his earlier association with Big Bear, Thunderchild did not partake in the movement to unite the Cree in 1883-1884. However, he was nonetheless a tenacious defender of treaty rights. In 1889, he refused to transfer ground for a Roman Catholic school on his reserve, arguing that it already had an Anglican school. When a school was built without his permission, he protested for 2 years to no avail. Finally, flying his treaty flag and wearing his treaty medal, he led his supporters in tearing down the building, which would have been like that one. The Thunderchild Reserve was on good land, and in 1902, rumors circulated that the band would be moved and the reserve sold to settlers, with both government officials and missionaries urging his band to surrender its land. Thunderchild reluctantly agreed to negotiations. In 1909, the band moved to a new reserve near Bright Sand Lake, but the full implementation of the agreement dragged on until the chief's death in 1927. Papaway, Chief Lucky Man. Born in the late 1830s, Lucky Man grew up to become a headman in the Big in the band of Big Bear and later a chief of the River people. When Big Bear tried to negotiate better terms for his people instead of signing treaties, the Canadian government attempted to undermine his leadership by promising to recognize as chief any Cree man who could get 100 people to enter a treaty. Lucky Man supported Big Bear. However, by 1879, his people were starving, and he was selected by 409 members of the band to lead them into Treaty 6. In the following years, Lucky Man was loyal to Big Bear's leadership and to other Cree leaders who supported treaty revision. In 1882, after failing to establish a Cree territory in the Cypress Hills by requesting contiguous reserves, all assistance from the Canadian government was cut off. Lucky Man's band agreed to go to the Battleford district and select a reserve site as a convenient means of attaining assistance for themselves and Big Bear's people. Lucky Man was later deposed as chief when he attempted to return to Cypress Hills. In 1885, he and 26 followers fled to the United States to avoid prosecution for fighting against the government. He was arrested for murder when he returned to Canada in 1896. Upon his release a year later, he returned to the United States, where he died in 1901. Métis. The Battleford area was home to several Métis communities in 1885. Some had grown up in the North Saskatchewan River Valley, establishing themselves as hunters and traders. Other families arrived from Red River, following the increasingly distant bison herds west. In the 1870s and early 1880s, a new wave of Red River Métis came to the Battleford region, pushed out of the new province of Manitoba by disappointment and frustration with the Euro-Canadian leadership emerging there, and pulled west by the ever-present promise of new opportunities on the frontier. The large number of Métis families who entered treaty was a distinctive feature of Treaty 6. However, the diverse ethnic makeup and socio-political relationships among Métis communities played havoc with the inflexible administrative frameworks imposed upon them. While many had differing opinions on whether to take treaty or not, in the end, many acquiesced with the realization that if they wanted their Indigenous rights to be recognized, it was their only option. When Métis frustration over unkept treaty promises prompted active resistance in 1885, the epicenter of Louis Riel's support was around Batoche in the South Saskatchewan River Valley. Riel's agents actively tried to recruit Métis communities in the Battleford area into joining the resistance, but met with mixed success. The Métis of this area suffered the same frustrations as they did, but did not necessarily agree on the best course of action to address them. The Canadian government used scrip along with treaties as a means of extinguishing Indigenous title in the newly acquired West. As the federal government placed more restrictions on the Indigenous peoples and the new agricultural economy began to take root in the region, the older hunting and trading economy was pushed northward. The Métis are descendants of Indigenous people and European and Euro-Canadian fur traders who worked in the fur trade era. They are their own distinct nation of people with their own inherent Indigenous rights.